What's up, guys?
Hi.
Hi. Third session of the day. Just finished talking about Abraham and Moses. And this next chapter I'm pretty excited about because for a couple different reasons. For one, we're kind of starting to get to the point of the Old Testament where, yes, you've heard the stories of some of these characters, but maybe you haven't read these whole books, or you've read these books and they've been really confusing. And it's been hard to see the overall story that these books play into. Why these books were written. What is their place in this storyline? So that you can see, as we've been talking about, how this all points back to Jesus. What does the land, the judges, and the kings have to do with pointing back to Jesus? What do all of these genealogies or land allotments telling us where the specific boundaries of these territories were? How does that translate to the New Testament? How do we make sense of that? So I kind of alluded, we're talking about the land, which they call the kingdom prepared. The land is the kingdom prepared. The judges, the kingdom polluted. And then the kings is the kingdom promised. So we're talking about the kingdom. That sounds very similar to what Jesus talked a lot about, right? The kingdom. Jesus was always talking about the kingdom. So we're looking at the kingdom before Jesus came. Let's look at the land. There's a really cool diagram. I want you guys to pull out your books with me for a second as we talk about this. To page 135. How many of you guys have heard of Jericho? Yeah? We all know that story, right? That is one of many cities that the Israelites had to take when they entered the land. This is just to start as an example of we might know some of these stories, we might not know it as a whole. Look at this. This map is incredible. It shows you some of the big things that they had to go through. So the big divider in Israel is the Jordan River, the Jordan Valley. So you have the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and those two bodies of water are connected by the Jordan River. And the Israelites had been on the outside of this land. They had come from Egypt, which Egypt is over here. They had come from Egypt to here in 40 years. That walk does not take 40 years. They were basically doing this for 40 years, walking around in circles, just killing time. But they finally got to the outside of the Jordan River. They can see the land. It's right across that river. And it's their time to enter into it. This is the promised land that God has been promising to his people, to Abraham and Moses, for generations. And these people can finally see it. The time is to enter into the land, the promised land. This is what they've been waiting for. This is what they've been hearing stories about. So they enter the land, and you can see Jericho is number 3. It is one of the first. It is the first on the other side of the Jordan Valley. The first city they have to conquer. And we know the story. God shows up for his people. He shows up for the Israelites. He tears down the walls and gives them victory. When the Israelites listen to God, when they allow God to be a part of their story and to be a part of their army, God does crazy things. And they continue to go. They go to the southern campaign, they go to the northern campaign. Look how many cities they have to conquer. This isn't all of them. This is just to give you an idea. This is a few of many. Just think about how many people were living in this land. God had given them the land, but nobody had told this people that God had given them the land. And as you can imagine, as these other cities start to hear what God did at Jericho, what God did at the next city, Ai, they start hearing these stories. The scriptures tell us their hearts were melting. They were realizing what was happening. They were realizing the power that God was giving the Israelites. They stood no chance. They could see this. They could see that they stood no chance against Yahweh, the God of Israel. We'll start talking a little bit more about this. The land judges and the kings. First slide. Life in the promised land does not provide them with enduring hope. And this is heartbreaking to see. Because we see how much, as I was talking about, they could see how much joy and excitement there is to enter into this land. The story of Joshua, of entering into the land, starts just after Moses has died. Basically, Moses dies, and then within the next week, they're crossing the Jordan. Because Moses was not allowed to enter into the land. And Joshua takes over for Moses and is the ruler of the Israelites and the commander of their army. And we see very, very, very quickly how fast they failed. They had one commandment from God: to remove the people, to take the land. Can you guess what they didn't do? They didn't remove all the people. Imagine that. The Israelites not following the command of God once again. They fall short. They removed a lot of the people, but God did not ask them to remove a lot of the people. God asked them to remove all of the people. And they did not remove all the people. We see it right away in Joshua. They literally had just taken the land. And Joshua 13:1 says this: "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years." So there had been some time there. He was old and advanced in years. They had conquered much of the land at this point. We're 13 chapters into Joshua. And the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess." Joshua had been here for years. The Israelites had been conquering for years, and there was still very much that they hadn't conquered. We go just a few more chapters in. Joshua is giving the people their allotments, where they're allowed to live, where God has given each tribe to live. And we're already seeing with Manasseh, in Joshua 17:12, it says, "Yet the people of Manasseh could not take possession of those cities, but the Canaanites persisted to dwell in their lands." We're not even out of the book of Joshua yet, and the people are already failing God. They're already not removing all of the people. The kingdom was promised, but they didn't take that promise, did they? They already failed. The land was a great promise that he was giving to his people, but the land could not save the people. Entering into this land was not where it started. Entering the land was the beginning. It was the first commandment that they were given outside, to go and take the land. And they're already failing. We're already seeing the need for Jesus. The people could not follow one simple command. It was a failure. They're dwelling in the land, yes, but they're not dwelling in the way that God designed them to dwell. They're dwelling in a lesser glory than God designed them. And God is not about lesser glory. We even see the conquest incomplete. I think that's another one of your slides. I got ahead of myself a little bit there. But even Joshua had sin. They needed a leader who had no sin to bring them into the land of abundance. And they will need a king. We haven't gotten there yet. They will need a king to reign over a kingdom that will never end. We haven't gotten to the kings yet. We're already seeing how Moses failed the people. He had sin. Abraham had sin. Joshua had sin. All of these people have sinned. The people then declared their commitment to God. Let's look at some more scripture. Later on in Joshua. Joshua 24:14-15 says this. It says, this is Joshua speaking to the people. "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt. Cast away these other gods and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, if you do not desire to fear the Lord, to serve him, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. Choose the God, or which gods you will choose to serve today." Joshua is telling the Israelites to make a choice. Whom you will strive, whom you will serve. Whether the gods of your ancestors, in whose land, or the ones in whose land you're living. And then Joshua says, "But for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." 3 verses later, the people respond. The Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord, as he is our God. The Israelites claim to want to serve the Lord. Joshua is calling them. He's doing his job to call them to serve the Lord. But then what he says in response to them, in the very next verse, hits us in the heart. Matt just talked about it a little bit. But he looks them in the eyes, Joshua does, and he tells them, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. And they were an unholy people. How would you feel? You're sitting there, you're in the promised land. You've just committed to follow God. And then he looks you in the face and says, you can't. Because you are unholy. And God is holy. And as Matt just talked about, holiness cannot be in the presence of unholiness. This was a big part of the story. But thankfully, this is not the end of the story. They needed a leader who was greater than Joshua. So in the end, the conquest of the land is incomplete, as is the hoped-for renewal of Israel and her people. So let's move on to the judges. I think that might be one of your slides, or fill-ins. The judges. What have you guys heard about the judges? This is not necessarily something we talk a ton about, but tell me a few things you know about the judges. Or do you guys know anything about the judges? 12 of them? Yeah, that's good. Just to summarize real quick what he said, they were humans. They were designated by God to return the people to following God's commandments when they would get out of whack. Anybody know a famous judge? There are a handful that are pretty famous. Judge Judy? Yeah, she's a judge, but not exactly what we're looking for here. I think Elijah knows. Samson, yes. We all know the story of Samson, right? When I was a kid, when I was very young, I had my mom read me the story of Samson every night. I was obsessed with Samson. And then I start reading the Old Testament for myself in high school. And I start to realize how bad of a guy Samson was. How barbaric these judges were. This is not a beautiful picture. These judges were ruthless people. They were not the kings that we'll get to. They were not Joshua and Moses. They were leaders that God gave his people to be warriors. They were military leaders. Their goal was to attack people, to lead the Israelites in war. They were good at that. They were really good at that. We know Samson was really good at that. But they were not good at leading the people morally. They were not good at leading the people to follow the commands of God. There's a really cool diagram, once again, to look at on 139. It's titled, quite appropriately, The Judges of Israel and the Cycle of Sin. And it just turns. It has all of the judges on here. And it's a continual cycle. Over and over and over again. Judges 2:19 really illustrates this well. It says, but when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Every time a judge died, the people would run back to what they were doing. They would run back to their slavery. They would run back to their sin. They would run back to not following God. And you have to continue the cycle again. You would have to raise up another judge to free his people from what they just were freed from and ran back to. It's a cycle of sin. These people are sinful. In the same way that we're sinful. It might manifest itself in different ways. We might not be out here murdering people. We might not be sacrificing to false gods or marrying people of different tribes that they weren't supposed to be. That might not translate exactly to what we're doing. But make no mistake, we are still sinful people. And we're still stuck in a lot of this cycle. Thankfully, we have Jesus. But if you've been a Christian for any amount of time, you know that there are good times and there are bad times. There are times where you love Jesus and there are times where you're struggling. Where there's sin prevalent and present in your life. They couldn't get rid of this sin. They couldn't measure up. They couldn't keep the commands of this holy God, for they were unholy people. They may have been free from the bondage of their physical slavery in Egypt. They were no longer slaves to Egypt, but they are now in spiritual slavery to their own sin. Think about Jesus. That's the goal of this whole week, is to start thinking about Jesus and how this story is telling us why we need Jesus. God's freedom from their physical slavery in Egypt. But how are they going to be free from their sin? How are they going to be free from this cycle? How are they going to get out of it? There needs to be someone better. Israel needs a better leader. It wasn't Samson. It wasn't Deborah. It wasn't Gideon or any of these other names that I'm too scared to pronounce in front of you guys. It wasn't any of them. And we're not going to get there today, but we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to it. For a time, the people lived in thankfulness and obedience. They followed for a little while when things were going well, when they could visibly see the people fleeing in front of them, when they could feel the power of God fighting before them. All was good. Things were going well. They were thankful and obedient. They remember the consequences. They remember what happened in the time of waiting when they weren't allowed to enter into the land. They remember that all of their ancestors had to die before they could enter the land, because that was a polluted generation and only this next generation could. But their changes were fleeting. They didn't stay changed. When things got hard, when they got comfortable in their land. Okay, we can live with one other tribe living here. We don't need to remove all the people. Maybe we'll just make them our servants. Maybe. It's a slippery slope. It's so easy to see how they got there. Well, God's already given us the land. We've already been faithful. We're doing better than our ancestors. It was fleeting. The book of Judges demonstrates Israel's need for a deliverer. The judges came to deliver Israel from the people around them, from the people physically oppressing them, from the people trying to kill them, to take their lands, to slaughter their animals and their children. That's what they came to deliver. But they need someone to deliver them more than just out of their physical state. We talk about we need a spiritual deliverance. The people could feel that. And it all points to Jesus. But God's promise to Abraham to make him into a great nation will be fulfilled through the kings. We'll go back one slide real quick. A little ahead of myself. So now we enter the time of the kings. The kings might be something we're a bit more familiar with. I'm sure we've heard of a few of the kings. The first three are probably the most popular that most of you could probably name. I'm not going to assume everyone could. But there are three main kings to start off. The problem here is how they get to being a king. how the Israelites desire a king. They went a long time having a set leader of their people. They had Abraham, they had Moses, they had Joshua. And then some of these judges started popping up. But they didn't stick around and some of them as long as those previous ones. And some of them were as faithful or as good. Like we see how incredibly God used those people and how great they are still today in our eyes. These judges didn't match up to that. They were more temporary fixes to deliver the people out of immediate danger. And so they went a long period of time after those 3 or 4 powerful leaders. And now they desire, once again, a powerful leader. And what do? They start looking all around at the people around them. They start looking at what do the Philistines have? What do the Syrians or the Persians have? What do these other people groups outside the land, or even the ones they left in the land, what do they have? Those people had a king. And the Israelites, as brilliant as they were, they start thinking to themselves, how great would it be if we also had a king? Shouldn't we get a king? God, why don't we have a king? Look at all these other people, God. They all have a king. Why haven't you given us a leader? Why haven't you given us a king? They get frustrated with God. And they want to be like the other people. That wasn't God's commandment, to be like the other people. It's like what Jesus says in the New Testament. We're to be in the world, but not of the world. We live here, but we're not supposed to live like the other people do. We're not supposed to live like the lost do. The Israelites were living in the promised land. They were to live as God's people. They were to follow the law and worship God. But they chose to be like the other people. They didn't like the system that God had put in place. They wanted something else, what they thought was better. But as we talked about the first day, as I talked about the first day, how could you improve on perfection? How can you improve on God's design? They pushed away. They did not want what God had ordained for them, what God had given them. They decided to pursue their own desires, pursue what they wanted. And now they wanted a king. But once again, we're going to see how God takes the failings of his people, the sin of the Israelites, to work powerfully through them, to turn what is bad for good. Because you know that through the kings, we get Jesus. God knows his people are going to go astray. This is all a part of the plan. He knows he's going to bring about kings. And then through those kings, he's going to give us Jesus. So how does this process begin? They pick Saul. Saul is to be the first king of Israel. And when you read about Saul, the reason they picked Saul, one of those reasons was because he was the most physically impressive man in Israel. This guy was huge. He was tall. He was handsome. He was strong. He had every physical characteristic that the world desires from a leader. He was a warrior as well. He had the whole package. But he is not the greatest king, right? He's not the king we remember as the greatest. He sins against the Lord. He too sins. He was anointed king over Israel by God. But he also fails. He also fails. So the next king needs to be risen up. The next king. The next king we should all know who King David is, right? We've all heard of King David. King David, it was not a peaceful transition of power. If you think about America, typically the transition between president to president is pretty smooth. We agree that every 4 to 8 years, whoever wins the election gets the presidency. It's a smooth transition. There's days and months where that transition is beginning We know what's happening. We know what to expect. We know how to get from one president to the next. The process of getting from one king to the next is not the same. Typically, for most societies, even up to today, a kingship is through lineage. So traditionally, the next king would have been one of Saul's sons. And we see that attempted to be happening. So one of Saul's sons attempts to take over the throne. And David spends a lot of time in the wilderness, fleeing Saul and also fleeing his sons who were trying to take the kingdom from him. But God has clearly anointed David the next king. God has chosen David as the next king. And we know that who God chooses to be king is going to be king. It takes a long process. It takes a while. But eventually David becomes king. He brings the people into prosperity. He is a mighty warrior as well, but he is not the physical specimen that Saul was. It talks about him being the youngest son, the smallest son. He was just out in the wilderness tending the shepherds. Sure, that toughened him up, but he was the youngest of a lot of brothers. The youngest was typically not the son honored in this time. Once again, we see God picking a humble person, picking someone who is not seen as the best in the world's eye. That was David. And he became a mighty warrior, a servant of God, to bring the Israelites into prosperity. They rectified, they changed a lot of the bad things that had happened. He brought them into prosperity. But we know David messes up too. We know that he can't be the perfect king. That he wasn't the perfect king. David failed at a lot. He committed adultery. He killed one of his closest servants to cover up that adultery, as well as a bunch of other stuff. David wasn't perfect. He might have been the best king. Once again, this is just going to show us that we need a perfect king. We don't need a human king. We need a perfect king. Once again, we're looking towards Jesus. We're looking to the future of the coming of our perfect king. That David couldn't be, that Saul couldn't be, that his son Solomon couldn't be. Well, let's talk about David and Solomon a little bit. Have you guys been talking about the covenants, where we had the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenant? Have you guys talked about that at all? Those covenants were basically just the promises that God was giving to his people at that point. And we've seen those fulfilled. The land has been given. The descendants of Abraham have been multiplying. And now there's a third covenant, what's called the Davidic covenant, which basically is just the covenant that God gives to David. There's a lot that encompasses that. Essentially, this covenant between God and David is that A, he will raise up his son Solomon to create the temple. Because David wants to make God this temple. But he was taken over by this sin. And God did not want David to be making this temple now because of the sin that David had chosen. But he had chosen the sin over the things of God. And so, God promises to David that his ancestors would be the one to build the temple. Because God desired this temple, but he wanted someone else to build it for him, a descendant of David. He promised that his lineage would continue, that the kings would continue to be of David, and that ultimately, the king would be of the line of David. This is where a big part of these genealogies that we have to read come into play. The first chapter of Matthew is just genealogies. But what we find from these genealogies is we get to see the story progress. We get to see how God got from the book of Ruth and Boaz to Jesse, to King David, to Solomon, to continue down the line until we get Jesus from that same line of David. How crazy is that? I think it was over 40 generations that it took. At least 40, I think it was way more than that, but at least 40 generations to get from David to Jesus. but he is faithful. He has made a covenant, and God will not fault on his covenant. And that's where this slide comes in. We got to way earlier. God's promise to Abraham to make him into a great nation is now being fulfilled through David, and further will fulfill the kingdom. The kingdom that Jesus talks about is the kingdom of God. The kingdom that these kings reigned over were just the people of Israel. They were God's people, but they were just a people group. The coming kingdom will be much bigger. And then even through all of the turmoil that goes on with Solomon, everything that goes on there, throughout all of it, God keeps one of David's descendants on the throne. He is faithful to David. He's faithful to keep his covenant. I don't know how much you know about Solomon. I won't talk a ton about him. But he does build a temple. And it is a beautiful temple that he builds to the Lord. Jesus makes Solomon the most prosperous of the kings. He could be the richest man in history. David had prosperity, but the wealth and wisdom that Solomon had just overcame his father. David's wealth and wisdom couldn't compare to what God gave to Solomon. But once again, Solomon sins. He stops following the will of God. And we move on to the next king. Because Solomon isn't Jesus. Solomon isn't the final king. He can't do what Jesus did. So I think, is that all of them? Okay, and to get to the end, as we continue to look forward, and just as God promised, his throne would last forever and ever. The kingdom of Jesus, his throne, will never be taken away. He will never disobey the will of the Father. He will never commit sin. He reigns as our eternal king, as our perfect king. That is who Jesus is. He's our deliverer that the judges couldn't be. He is our king that the kings couldn't be. He is the greater promise that the land couldn't be. Jesus is the ultimate one. He is the one that we worship, we praise, we give thanks to. So as we're getting ready to close, I want to pull us back to one more diagram. As I was talking about earlier, I love this book because of what it shows you and how powerful these diagrams can be. So even just looking at the last page, 143, you have this massive, complex diagram. And it looks pretty hard to read. But I want you guys just to see a few things to hopefully help you understand how to read it. So, in the middle, the blue blocks, we have the prophets, which I think is a session coming up, so I won't talk too much about the prophets. But it shows you who the prophet was at that time. On the left hand, it has the kings and how long they reigned. So we see Saul, his son Ishbosheth, which tried to take the kingdom from David. And then we have David, and then we have Solomon. And then the colors are also important, because that's on the right side. It tells you what those colors mean. The green means a good king. David was almost all green. But we see Saul and Solomon, they start off green, and they start moving towards the gray, which are the bad kings. And that's where my session ends. But after the next couple sessions, I want you guys to look back upon this again. Because you can see the rest of the kings, the rest of the prophets. You can see what happens there.